Picture this. The best man in Europe, warlord of fields from Egypt to Austria, master of empires and architect of dominions, quaking in fear at the thought of something the rest of us walk into daily without even breaking a sweat. Napoleon Bonaparte, the man who looked down into the muzzles of enemy guns and remapped the very continent of Europe, had within him a fear so enormous, so profound, as to reduce to an absolute state of terror such a colossus of history. You would think that it would be death on the battlefield, or even the guillotine that had claimed so many lives before him, maybe the threat of exile, or the rebellion of his enemies. But you'd be wrong. Napoleon's biggest enemy was something much more unexpected, something that reveals the very flesh and blood nature of a man that history has attempted to make into a nearly godlike figure. Today, we're going to discover what frightened the Emperor of the French, and, in the process, learn how terrifyingly banal the phobias of the best among us are. In order to understand Napoleon's terror, we first have to ride with him back in time to the years of the crisis of the French Revolution, where a young Corsican artillery officer would begin his meteoric rise to greatness. Napoleon Bonaparte was born in 1769, a year following France's annexation of Corsica, and grew up amidst a world of political instability and social upheaval. Paris's stone streets echoed with revolutionary slogans, and the acrid flavor of gunpowder hung in the air forever as the old order crumbled and the new struggled to be born. Napoleon, with questioning gray eyes and burning fervor, had almost a supernatural ability to read the disorder at hand and mold it to his will. In 1799, he had orchestrated a coup that would see him at the helm of the government of France as first consul. The young general who spent hours poring over maps by candlelight years earlier in war schools now held France's destiny in his hands, and he would not let it go. Napoleon in the early 1800s was at the height of his war mind, waging campaigns to would be taught in centuries of war schools to come. At Austerlitz in 1805, he lured the Austrian and Russian forces, united in one last bid to thwart him, into a trap so clever it was the Battle of the Three Emperors. The morning fog clung to the Moravian ridges as Napoleon disposed his men with mathematical precision, leading the enemy to believe they had them at their mercy before unleashing a crushing counterattack that shattered their ranks like glass. His Grand Armée swept across Europe like a river, eagles glinting in sunlight as it pushed on from victory to victory. From Egypt's desolate steppes to Poland's snowy fields, Napoleon exhibited a near-wizard's ease of outmaneuvering, outwitting, and outfighting his enemies. He could read a battlefield in a matter of minutes, seeing weaknesses that no one else would ever quite see, and his troops were fanatically loyal to him. But under all these veneers of invulnerability, under crown, imperial, and purple robes, simmered a terror which would sometimes erupt into the most unlikely of corners. The Tuileries Palace court of the empire was a kingdom of ceremony and silk, where a single movement made the difference, and a single word was carefully. It was here, in the gold salons, where Napoleon entertained kings and ambassadors, that courtiers first caught sight of something being wrong with their emperor. At state dinners, if conversation broached certain subjects, Napoleon would squirm in visible embarrassment, his normally commanding demeanor uncertain. His aide, General Durac, described how once the emperor's hands would tremble a bit before his worst horror, and how he would attempt to divert the topic away or escape from the room itself. This was not conscious withdrawal on the part of an analytical mind. This was the reflex flight of a man confronted by something that pierced to the very core of his existence. The courtiers whispered among themselves, trying to understand how a man who had defied the combined strength of the monarchies of Europe was reduced to ruin by something as seemingly innocent. To understand Napoleon's fear, we will have to take into account his Corsican background and the deeply entrenched superstitions that ruled his life from boyhood. Corsica, that rugged island of the Mediterranean with its old traditions and mystic mythologies, had inscribed in young Napoleon an ill-at-ease bond to the supernatural and to superstition. Letitia Romolino Bonaparte, his mother, had made his childhood a succession of tales of omens and portents, of auguries that could betoken good or ill. The Corsican culture in which Napoleon was raised was a culture in which the boundary between reason and mystery was sure to be less clear-cut, in which pupils may have simultaneously adhered to Enlightenment philosophy and ancient superstition. And this cultural inheritance endowed Napoleon with a strange weakness, an almost pathological antipathy towards cats. Yes, cats, those ubiquitous domestic pets most of us affectionately think of, or, worst case, with indifference. To Napoleon, the presence of a cat, especially a black one, was enough to induce a fit of terror in its entirety, contrary to his otherwise obstinate resolve. This is the phobia it would eventually be referred to as, and this would haunt him at the worst possible junctures of his reign. The imperial archives, tenderly preserved in the cellars of French libraries, are replete with accounts of Napoleon's confrontations with his worst nightmares. One of the most vivid was at a reception in Fontainebleau in 1807, when a tabby cat wandered into the throne room during negotiations with Tsar Alexander of Russia. Eyewitnesses recounted how the Emperor of the French, having routed the Russian army the day before at Friedland, paled and perspired. His otherwise commanding and resonant voice was strained as he struggled to maintain his dignity, as he swept his arms wide for servants to remove the offending beast. The Tsar, initially bewildered by Napoleon's behavior, afterwards remarked to his advisors about the strange incident and the fact that the master of Europe had been more frightened by a little cat than he had been by enemy guns. There was another reported incident in the Egyptian campaign where Napoleon's tent was invaded by a stray cat during a crucial strategic meeting. Troops there wrote that their commander, who had conducted a cavalry charge along the desert floor hours earlier, became so angry he threw maps off tables and papers out of their clips in his rush to exit the tent. Modern psychologists have speculated with great enthusiasm over the etiology of Napoleon's phobia, and their hypotheses make for a fascinating profile of how experiences in childhood shape even the most dominant personality. The phobia may have been due to a traumatic event in Napoleon's early life on Corsica, e.g. that it had a feral cat or had seen a superstitious ritual where cats played a part that was not favorable. Others attribute this to the wider cultural environment of 18th century Europe, in which cats were most directly linked with witchcraft and wicked supernatural powers. Jumping black cats across one's path were omens of ill luck, and for a man whose livelihood depended entirely upon his skill at reading signs and portents, such an emblem was overwhelmingly oppressive. Napoleon's physician, Dr. Antoine Dubois, had once speculated in his own personal diary that the emperor's fear seemed to intensify with strength when political tension was most prevalent, which in turn meant that the phobia was a manifestation of emotionalized anxieties that could not be discharged otherwise. The irony was not lost on historians of the time. Here is a man who had fought the armies of Europe, who had walked through fields littered with dead and dying, and could be reduced almost to panic by seeing an animal that likely weighed 10 pounds. Why Napoleon's timidity is so convincing historically is the manner. On occasion, it influenced his choices and the extensive steps his staff went to in order to satisfy his requests. The imperial court mastered an unwritten yet strictly followed procedure for the evacuation of cats from any room the emperor was to enter. Advance parties would clean out reception rooms, palaces, and even field command posts to make sure that no cat encounter was possible. This fanatical care in cat-proofing was extended to diplomatic sites, where French diplomats would quietly ensure that any cats were removed from buildings in which serious diplomacy was to be held. Some even went so far as to theorize that Napoleon's hesitation to declare one of his command posts some of the occupied towns might have been because of their loose cat populations. Napoleon maintained his command post during the 1799 sieges of Acre at a peculiar distance from the walls of the city, which some put down to observations of the countless cats that filled the ancient citadel. Although it's impossible to put a number on just how much this phobia contributed to the shaping of major events in history, it did add an unpredictability factor to Napoleon's interactions that his foes could never be ready for. Even while in exile on the island of Elba, Napoleon's phobia still plagued him, albeit somewhat differently. The feral cat colony on the Mediterranean island was sizable, tracing back to ancient Roman colonies, and the overthrown emperor resented them as a source of persistent annoyance. His small entourage of devoted servants found themselves placed in the peculiar position of providing a cat-free zone to their former lord, an unexpected challenging task given the feral cat colony on the island. Modern accounts of travelers to Elba describe how Napoleon would change his walking routes daily or delay outdoor outings if cats had been spotted in the vicinity. One of the first orders given to his return staff when, as part of his legendary 100 days, he defied exile and returned to France for his final quest for power, was to restore the old catcalls. Even against the coalition that would finally defeat him at Waterloo, Napoleon's staff continued to stand guard against his closest enemy, a credit to his charisma and the loyalty he inspired. His followers upheld this obligation even as the empire itself started to deteriorate around them. Napoleon's phobia gives us insight into the nature of humanity and the power that goes into even the largest of historical figures. Here was a man who could determine the fate of nations with the sweep of a pen, who had rewritten the laws of entire civilizations, whose name would echo through the centuries to come. And he was still fundamentally human, subject to the same illogical phobias and neuroses as the rest of humanity. This frailty humanizes Napoleon in a manner his military victories and political successes never did, reminding us there under the imperial purple and the haze of invincibility was a Corsican man who never quite outgrew a fear of childhood. His phobia also serves to demonstrate the complex interplay between public appearance and private truth, with which all leaders must contend. While Napoleon had projected himself with an aura of invincible self-assurance and mastery, his phobia was a defect in that well-rehearsed facade, a reminder that even emperors must confront their weaknesses. The complicated precautions to protect him from cats symbolize not just the passion of his followers, but also the recognition that great leaders, like all human beings, have aspects of themselves to be preserved and interpreted. Projecting back to Napoleon's astonishing terror, we are reminded that history's greatest successful leaders were, first and foremost, human beings with the entire gamut of human frailties and emotions. The man who conquered much of Europe and whose written law still impacts jurisprudence today was terrorized by animals that most of us would categorize as benign acquaintances. This is a contradiction that resists our desire to imagine great historical personages as larger-than-life personas, compelling us instead to consider them as multifaceted human beings, driven by the same psychological and experiential forces that drive all of us. The moral of the story of Napoleon is that courage isn't the absence of fear, but the unwillingness to act timorously despite it, except perhaps where the fears are of small four-legged creatures with whiskers and tails. In coming to know this most human aspect of Napoleon's character, we come to know not only something about one of the great men of history, but something also greater about the larger-than-life nature of human weakness and the way our worst fears will ultimately come to shape our existence. What are your thoughts regarding Napoleon's strange phobia? Does it change your perception of this giant from the past? If you now know that he was intimidated by cats? Let us know in the comments below, and don't forget to subscribe for more untold histories bringing you the unexpected human side of celebrities. If you did learn something today, don't forget to like this video and that bell so that you never miss our deep dives into the secrets of history.